Brad, we'd certainly like to welcome you here on behalf of the School of Printing and the Melbert B. Carey Library, and certainly are very happy to have you here as a recipient of the 15th Goudy Award. And in so doing, we'd like to have this interview for the students who will be coming to RIT in the future, and those that are here presently who may not get an opportunity to ask questions and so forth, but would like to, or perhaps won't attend the session tonight. So I'd like to ask you to begin with, if you'd give us a little bit of an idea of how you became interested in the graphic arts and printing, and perhaps give us just a little background on your start.
Well, thank you, Al. It is a great pleasure and an honor to be here with you. I've been so impressed and have so enjoyed the RIT campus and facilities. About my own background, there are certain parallels I find. I went to high school in Topeka, Kansas, and was the art director of the high school yearbook 3 years, and at the same time I was working for a civil engineer. I worked closely with draftsmen, drawing plans for bridges and roads. That was in itself a great advantage. And in college, I attended the local college, Washburn College, where I was editor and designer. The whole responsibility of the college yearbook 2 years, and helped out on other years. The college yearbook there, the business manager and the editor had full responsibility. If money was made, the editor and manager made it. If they didn't, they made it up. And so there was such excellent learning there. And working on the yearbooks where you had full responsibility, I worked with the local printers, the printing company that had done many of the yearbooks in the town, a family organization that composed of 4 brothers and 2 nephews, and 2 sons, 1 son, I should say. And I was, and with the local engraving company. Of course, it was all letterpress.
Oh, yes.
And the great kindness and environment of working with these people who were truly teachers, but not quite in the sense of you being teachers, but they were. And I had, the college was a mile and a half from the downtown district, and I thought of, I had the great privilege of going through the same experience in a way that you offer here. You have the most magnificent facilities, all the different ingredients of printing, engraving, art, editing, and I just thought I was very fortunate, like your students, in an entirely different way. And after, the important thing about that experience, I think, was having libraries. The college library and the city library had books, magazines, Europe. I don't know if anybody else on the campus looked at them, but I did. I would go behind the stacks, and here I was in Europe. I might have been in Europe or in New York or in Chicago. So libraries are great things in my life. And I felt that when I came to New York 5 years after college that I was there to compete with the very best, and I wanted to, and it was fun being there in New York.
Well, maybe you'd like to ask a question now.
Yes, thank you, Al. Well, I do know that you started with Rogers, Kellogg, Stilson in New York, and I don't know whether or not it's true, but you started your connection with Wes Vaco, or West Virginia Paper Company, almost immediately. Is that true?
Yes, that's right. Herbert,
Maybe you
yes.
could tell us about it.
Well, I had a nice connection with Dr. Aga, at the great art director at Condé Nast, Vanity Fair, Vogue, and the other, and House and Garden. And I had invited him to select the beauty queen in my college yearbook, so I had a good correspondence with him. And but then I stopped in Chicago on my way from Topeka to New York. At that point, 5 years after graduation, I realized that as much as I loved Topeka and my old friends, I had to leave. It was sad, but I had to leave. I stopped in Chicago at the Lakeside Press, where I had an introduction and met William Kittredge. I don't know if that name means anything to you, but he was one of the great men, and he was not only a fine designer and art director and head of a great publishing unit. He was a very generous man. He called in his secretary. This was a Saturday morning when people worked on Saturday mornings. He brought his whole design staff in to look at my portfolio, which I had been working on very hard through the years, and invited these real professional designers to come in and look at them. And then, to my great surprise and pleasure, he called in his secretary and wrote 7 letters to men in New York, to Alexei Brodovich at Harper's Bazaar, and Francis Brennan, the art director of Fortune magazine, and to Mike Griswold, who was the president of Rogers Kellogg Stilson, a very fine printing company, a combination of three great printers, Rogers, Kellogg, and Stilson. And Gilbert Tompkins, the representative who brought over Cassandra and Goretto and those very sophisticated designers of that time. I met Mr. Griswold at Rogers Kellogg Stilson, and I also had a nice meeting with Dr. Aga. And I wouldn't have had the courage to meet these people if I hadn't had the letters of introduction. Something that we all try to do now, I know. I went home, that was in August, and on the same weekend I received 2 letters, one from Dr. Aga and one from Mr. Griswold. And I had to make a decision. I knew that Wes Vaco Inspirations was handled at Rogers Kellogg Stilson. I thought, here is a great opportunity to, I believe, to have things my own way, as I did editing and designing the college yearbooks. And as much as I admired Dr. Aga, I felt I wanted to be on my own. And so I went to work at Rogers Kellogg Stilson. And my first day there, a man named Folks, Charlie Folks, brought in 20 sheets of white paper, made in a blank dummy, put it on my desk and said, here, design Wes Vaco Inspirations. And I was prepared because I had done things completely on my own, yearbooks, college publications, worked with the printers and engravers. And it was great. I just went to work and did them for 61 issues.
Fantastic.
But great. The thing I haven't mentioned is the great help from people and those teachers, especially back in Kansas, you know.
Yes. Well, if I might follow up on this just a bit, you still have a relationship with Wes Vaco, I understand.
Yes, I have been since November of 1939. I have had some activity with them continuously. And I have, since 1950 or so, designed their annual reports and that sort of thing, corporate, their trademarks.
There must be some sort of record for tenure in art directorship.
Well, that
Sure is today.
Yes.
it has been a very good experience.
Good.
Brad, you've spent most of your life working with the printed material. Do you have any particular preference? You work with magazines, you work with postage stamps, you work with all these things for the various paper companies, and calendars. Does anything stand out now? Of course, books and the Bible for the Washburn Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Does anything in particular generate more interest than another, or?
Do you mean as I look back?
Well, I wouldn't want to say is anything a favorite of yours, but do you find one thing, the challenge of one type of printing design gets a little more out of you than something else, or are they all pretty much equal at the time, perhaps?
Well, any project where you know you are fully responsible and where it's nice to work with a whole magazine staff, but it's much more satisfying to be able to do a book, a small book, a big book, a publication like Wes Vaco Inspirations was. I was able to do almost anything that I wanted to. I was fully responsible. And the one reason I think of your great institution here, I came from the Midwest, but I had a thorough understanding of printing and engraving and the art studio and the drafting room. And so coming to work on inspirations, I feel that I somehow during a good part of that period, well, there were certain restraints that should be mentioned. Wes Vaco had a good budget for plates that were collected from advertising agencies. That was the way it had been for a number of years, 15 years, I guess. And that that didn't satisfy what I really wanted to do, to just get the very best printing, the very best illustrations and photographs and reproduce them nicely. I wanted to express myself. And so with that background of printing and engraving, in fact, Rogers Kellogg Stilson had both offset and letterpress equipment right next door to where my office was.
I see.
So I put into practical use the experiences that I had had in printing and in engraving. I found, for instance, a great illustration of dancers, Middle Eastern sort of dance. And that was the idea, to take those 4 printing plates apart that I knew were making that one impression and put them into a dancing-like situation on the page, so that the whole page became a dance of our own ingredients, of printing plates and color. And then I found that it wasn't a great satisfaction to simply reproduce a work of art if I didn't do something myself about it. And I found that maybe it was better to just get a black and white illustration and print it 4 times to bring motion on the page and to integrate type fully. Up until this point, Wes Vaco Inspirations, for instance, was usually 2 columns with pictures inserted. This was the way of graphic arts at that time.
That standard format.
But here was an opportunity to take everything in my own hands, make a 2-page spread, integrating type, idea, heading, pictures in my way. And it was a great experience.
I think that's on exhibition, isn't it? That the one you just spoke of with the dancers?
Yes, it probably is. It could be.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, while we're still on the subject of your relationship with Wes Vaco, could you tell us a little about that classic series, the American Literary Classics? I suppose you have been issuing them now for, what, 25 years or more?
Yes, this would be the 26th.
26. Wonderful.
Well, back in 1958, the president of the company called the public relations director in, and he in turn spoke to me. It was just after Christmas time, and I think the president was paying bills for his sales organization, probably for bottles of scotch or cases of scotch, things that are often given.
Right.
And he wanted to know what could be done, what could be better than a book made of paper, and American classics.
That's right.
I think the American classics selection was just right because, again, I was not interested in doing something that had been done before, but having American classics, which would always please the reader, do a good, substantial American job for the company, but to take these classic things and do things that were original or that were fun, and so there have been 26 of them now this year. I'm always so pleased. You mentioned Massimo Vignelli, who was very kind on one occasion at an American Institute of Graphic Arts show that followed an honor there. And he is somewhat younger. He volunteered to come in and design my show, which he did, and he's very good at that kind of thing. Because he had seen in Italy an issue of Wes Vaco Inspirations, one of them where there was movement, this kind of thing that I was talking about. And but he's so sophisticated and all, I got a great enjoyment out of. He thought the Red Badge of Courage was so good. I've often thought, well, that's kind of corny, but the bullet hole and the drops of blood. But that's all he wanted for helping me out was the Red Badge of Courage. So there are things like that in that series that have been fun. Some of them you do as many things as 25, and some of them you think are pretty good, and some of them you just wish you hadn't done. There's just no way to avoid that. While you're doing it, you think you're doing great.
Of course, of course.
You've, I hope I'm not stealing Herb's thunder here, but I had a question too regarding your experimentation with the alphabet and talking about alphabet 26 and mono alphabet. I wondered, did some of your thinking on that come out of the experiments, perhaps, that were held in the Bauhaus in Germany?
Well, yes, that's where it started. Dr. Leslie's own little PM and AD magazine had a piece in there about the Bauhaus, and it was their thought, as I remember, using all lowercase, was to economize in the number of letters and to eliminate the caps. And I had the opportunity to do something about that personally, and I did a whole issue of Wes Vaco Inspirations during the war, all lowercase, just to try it out. And it was very clear that it had some reasons, but it was hard to read. You have to have a large letter beginning a sentence, and you have to have a large letter to designate a proper noun. And so on the issue you referred to, I believe, as the monalphabet,
Right.
I just thought, well, I'm going to have some fun and make every spread lead up to what I think might be the answer. The first one was all lowercase. The second spread was all caps, all caps, everything caps, and a little note down below my analysis. And of course, my analysis was that I guess the first one was the traditional style, upper and lower case for everything. The next was all caps, and then the next all lowercase. And as I mentioned, the all lowercase wasn't efficient for the reader. So I tried out other things. The next spread tried out, well, how about using just a bullet instead of a cap letter at the beginning of every sentence? And that was another thing to show it wasn't just right. The next one was, well, no, it wasn't a bullet either. I underlined each lowercase letter that should be a cap.
Should be a cap, yes.
And then the next thing was with Futura, which I was using, having light, bold, medium type. I used the bold lowercase wherever the cap had previously functioned. And that was quite good. It didn't quite work because Futura did not have the light. If I'd used the light and the bold, it would have gave the proper emphasis. It would have given the proper emphasis. But that, I think, was quite satisfactory. In fact, I did the 33rd annual of advertising art. I made a game for myself. The whole thing was monalphabet, Bodoni book and Bodoni, Ultra Bodoni. And then the next spread, the final one, I showed the enlargement of lowercase letters to function as caps. Now that worked all right with the O. The O is the same whether it's large or small, the S, the V, the W. But the lowercase h exceeds the metal, the type itself. So I started for fun to redesign that h so that the ascender would not be too tall, and worked out that way. I think it was fun, and people took note of it, and always the response with inspirations. Students, Pratt Institute, I was aware, always got a dozen issues that were spread among the students, and J. Walter Thompson Advertising Agency had a dozen that they circulated. So I knew that I was having a response from this inspirations, and I wanted to do it and have fun with my onlookers, and so. But that led to something else 5 years later. That was 45. I still wanted to, well, the conviction, the logic seemed to me to be that one alphabet, we keep referring to these letters of ours as symbols. They are symbols, but like as I became more interested in corporate design, the fact that symbols need to be uniform whether they're large or small. The Red Cross isn't one shape when it's small and another shape when it's... So the main thrust of my thinking then was, well, it should be, the symbol should be the same. And I knew that those lowercase letters like H and the others that had ascenders or descenders wouldn't work as functioning as capital letters. So I analyzed the alphabet, and we have about a third of them, of the letters that are similar in caps or lowercase, true to the
Right.
logic of symbols. A third of them, the caps would work because they didn't have ascenders and descenders. And then that some of the letters, A, E, M, and N, and R, didn't have ascenders or descenders. And well, they could be used and mixed with the caps. So the A, E, M, and N, and the R was eliminated because it's a poor letter anyway, with its horizontal coming out, making space.
Right.
So it was a mixture of caps and lowercase. Probably the deciding factor is not most of my work, but many of my issues came from my own family, my own children. A young son, age 6, learning to read, sat on my lap, read the book, and it said, run, pal, or something, let's see, how did it work? Anyway, the cap letter R in the first line was repeated, run, pal. And then down below it said, see him run. And he didn't know that second run. I thought, well, he must have
With the
learned to
lower
run in
case.
the above. But it's an entirely different symbol.
That's right.
R-U-N with a cap R and with a lowercase R, they're just on. So that's what happened. I mixed the alphabets. And it was great fun, too, because people criticized. I used Baskerville.
Yes.
Baskerville, you can mix small caps and lowercase because they're the same size on the lowercase size. But someone at one of the good printing magazines set his whole article in Bodoni and said, "Oh, isn't this a laugh?" Well, of course, Bodoni, small caps are halfway between the lowercase body and the cap. So it was just an awful mixture.
Would be.
So that those were interesting things, and that alphabet 26 caused quite a eruption of things at photo lettering. By what it was the word they gave biforms.
Biforms, right.
Biforms, which came
That's
because
right.
of that thing, and then they mixed. Guys were mixing all sorts of letters just for fun, but not for reason.
No.
We see
Took a
that
long time on
quite
that,
a
I'm
few names in advertising now. I think you mentioned a certain local beer that had that you saw the sign going down to Case Hoyt.
Yes, your Genesee beer
That's right.
did
Right.
have that. I don't know if they use it.
I don't think they use it all the time, but
You see it
there
a
are
lot.
some.
You see it a lot for a way of making a trade name.
Right.
Well, I have a question, Brad, about your activities in the area of postage stamps and the Citizens Advisory Board for the U.S. Postal Service. I know that for many years you have been designing stamps, and I really have two questions. One is, how did you get started with the postage stamp designs or designing? And the second one is, do you feel in any way that designing in such a small size sort of limits your options?
Well, I designed a stamp in 1958, but then I didn't design another one until 1964 or 5. And I was asked to design the American music stamp.
Oh, yes.
And this has something to do with size. I simply went to an old 18th century French book of Annette's, selected a beautiful little engraving of musical instruments, and 18th century French. That was a part of our nation in the 18th century. So I selected 18th century English Baskerville to go with it. And it turned out very well. I was to my great surprise, but that was a matter of not trying to use something very large, but something that was reasonably small to begin with, that I knew would work. But using gray paper with little threads in it enhanced
sort of like
that.
currency paper.
Yeah.
And that was a very nice experience, and Stephen Dohanis was on the board. In fact, he was chairman, and he found working with me was quite pleasant, and he asked me to, or I guess he went to the board, and they suggested I join the board because of some certain understanding of stamps, just naturally. But there really is no trick to designing stamps that there is not in designing a great huge poster. They both, you view a poster from a distance perhaps equivalent to viewing a stamp close up. It's something that you have to think about.
Well, there are certain restrictions, I would imagine, in the shapes that you're allowed to use.
Yes, well, the stamps are limited to just a very few shapes.
Just a few shapes.
Yeah.
And then you always have to have the amount of postage plus US, I would imagine.
USA, yes.
USA.
That was something that I was able to contribute to, having worked on, again, symbols occasionally for companies. And this thing of my conviction that letters are symbols, part of that. And realizing that the stamps, often the designer would put USA, or United States of America postage, United States postage, United States.
Right.
There was no consistency. So I was able to, when asked, to contribute to that and recommend that only USA 20C, lowercase c, or USA 25C or whatever, just that and nothing else. And it was certainly in order. Canada has done that even before we were.
What about the, there are several methods of reproduction that they use at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. And the marvelous intaglio stamps, well, I've already said they're marvelous, and I wonder if you feel the same way or whether you prefer the ones that are printed offset or the, I don't suppose they do any collar type, do they?
No. Well, of course, the intaglio, as you say, are so pleasant. They're like money. They're engraved in the great tradition of intaglio and printing and engraving. And that is satisfactory, but that runs too slow. In our country,
I see, yes.
you have to turn out 1 billion Christmas stamps of one kind, 1 billion religious stamps, a billion non-religious stamps.
Yes.
And there is a new press that includes, well, as you have noticed, I'm sure, that a good many of the stamps have been gravure.
Yes.
And that isn't altogether satisfactory because that dot in gravure printing. And when you have small lettering, it gets down to 5-point lettering usually.
Oh, I know. Yes.
It doesn't make a good sharp letter. There is a new press that has both in the same press, intaglio and offset. Now this is really great to be able to have both of those media.
The best of both.
The best of those two media.
Did you design the upcoming Christmas stamps that
Yes.
are due out?
The new one that's
I
coming
think they're
out?
due out next month.
Yes, it's the 500th birthday of Raphael. And Madonna, classic Madonna, so that's
Of the
appropriate.
chair. That one, the seated Madonna, is that the one?
Well,
you're
he did
using?
so many
Yes, I
seated
know.
ones,
Well, that's true,
actually.
so I guess, yeah.
There was
Well,
one,
can hardly wait.
but I have, again, had the privilege of doing 11 of the last 12, I think.
Right, right.
Well, I wish we had more time to explore. I was going to ask about your thoughts about some of your contemporary designers, Paul Rand and Lester Beale and Lou Dorfman and William Golden, of course.
Yeah.
And these people that have kind of paralleled in time at least, and ask perhaps you can give us a quick assessment of how you look at a problem, how you think they do, or maybe this is an unfair question.
No, I admire all of their work. Each one is an individual. When you're young, and if you are committed, you have to commit yourself to running a race with the best, or those in your sphere, in your interest. And as you get older, you become more mild about the whole thing. You admire them as they should be properly, and they've all been very good. And there are a lot of undiscovered ones who are going to show up too. There are a lot of wonderful designers who just haven't, whose work is hidden. I think we'll find that out. Students, even. And
I'm sure of that. There's always somebody coming up from behind in any field.
It's true.
I'm sorry I didn't get to speak on my favorite subject, but I will sometime. That's the Bible.
The Bible. Well,
You'll
we
get a
can-
chance this evening.
This evening. I wish we could have recorded your comments earlier before the
I know.
classes.
Before the class today, yes.
But
I want to thank you very much for giving us this time. I know it'll be appreciated over the years to come. Thanks
Certainly will.
again.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Brad.